Hi, I'm Stanley Goldberg, host of the Inquiring Mind podcast. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. And if you're new here, I release 2 episodes a week with a variety of fascinating guests, and I would appreciate if you would support my podcast by liking this video and subscribing down below. Thank you for your support, and now to today's guest. Sidney Blumenthal, welcome to the Inquiring Mind podcast.
Thank you.
Before we get started, I know you've written a lot of books about a variety of subjects, about the Republican Party, about political campaigns in the past. You have a memoir of your time in the Clinton White House that I have right here, The Clinton Wars.
That's it.
So I really enjoyed it. It's an inside kind of scoop of the Clinton White House from different perspectives. We'll get to that. You embarked on a ambitious 5 volumes about Abraham Lincoln. You're on your third, if I'm not mistaken, and
Fourth.
it's all
Fourth.
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 Sorry.
There are 3 that are published.
There you go. But All the Powers of Earth, that's the most recent one. So obviously, I just mentioned that you've written on such a wide variety of subjects. Why Lincoln and why now?
Well, if I had just embarked on the 5-volume work on Lincoln right now, I would be the world's fastest writer, having already produced about 1 million words in 3 volumes already. I started writing this incredibly, as I reflect on it, about a dozen years ago. I grew up in Illinois, in Chicago, which is in Illinois. And when I was in school, Lincoln was the god of our classroom. And we were always the prairie state of Lincoln. I was taken to Springfield as a boy by a cousin who was a traveling salesman. And we saw the shrines and sites, and it made an indelible impression upon me at a time that I was awakening to the existence of the political world. About 1960, when John F. Kennedy was first running for president, which dates me. And it was also the centennial of the Civil War. And it was at a time when the civil rights movement was taking off, which I paid a lot of attention to, and was deeply engaged by it. And even as a teenager, attended a couple of rallies led by Martin Luther King. So I've always had this interest in Lincoln. I began to work on presidents and race after I had finished the Clinton Wars. And I fell deeper and deeper into the past until I got to Lincoln, and then stayed there and began to figure out exactly how this had all developed over time. And it wasn't simply the question of race. I was also interested in the nature of the presidency, having worked in the White House. And also how Lincoln, who had faced the greatest crisis in our history, had been able to master it through his political skill and acumen and understanding of human nature, which are all political attributes. The idea of Lincoln as a mythic figure, somehow akin to Jesus on the Mount, is not who Lincoln was. He was an empathic person. He was a person who felt deeply. He suffered depression, what they called melancholy then, but he was political to the marrow of his bones. And having had the experience that I've had, various experience, having been a journalist for the Washington Post in Washington, the the New Republic in the old days, when it was the New Republic, and the New Yorker for many years. And then having worked in the White House, close to a president, I thought I had very unusual experience that I could bring to bear on this central subject, that when I began 12 years ago, had no idea as year by year ticks by would become more and more contemporary in an age of division and even insurrection.
Did you notice any similarities between your time in the White House and back in Lincoln's time?
Well, the main building's the same building. So I spent, my time. I had an office in the West Wing, which was not built until the early 20th century. It did not exist in Lincoln's time. Everything took place within the executive mansion, the White House proper. Um, but I spent a lot of time there. I was upstairs in the living quarters, and I had a very good sense of the physical building. And you can, you get a sense of where people lived, and you can imagine, Lincoln in his study, which was on the second floor. I've been in the room; you can see it. So there's that. But even more than the physical nature of things, is an understanding of American politics in Washington from the locus, the central point of the White House as it deals with the nation, the world, and also the other dimensions of government, the courts, and especially the Congress. So it's something I saw and worked on myself firsthand. And it provides unparalleled insight. I find that my experience gives me, I hope, an understanding of the events of the past that is gives me insight that others may lack, including certain academics who lack that experience and don't understand the deep political nature of Lincoln and the nature of conflicts and ambition and politics, the character of being in the Capitol and what Washington is like, even though it changes constantly. It's a very changeable city, and yet it remains a distinct capital with its own characteristics. So those are all things that I think I brought to bear on this project.
Do you think a person that doesn't doesn't have your kind of experience, could they have written a book volumes like you've written about the
Well,
political life?
there are more books on Lincoln than almost any other subject. Um, and, they're brilliant, wonderful, and illuminating books on all sorts of angles about Lincoln and his world. And there are many things that I don't have firsthand knowledge of that some of them do, particularly the military side. But I do understand politics and have been engaged in politics, and I think I can provide that kind of understanding. The other thing is, as a result of that, I tend to value and or at least give weight and assess the opinions of those who lived through the events themselves and their memoirs and letters, perhaps more than some of the historians who have been subject to various schools of historiography or ideologies, so-called revisionist historians of the beginning in the 1920s through the 30s who wrote about Lincoln in the Civil War, who tended to blame a blundering generation and abolitionists for their agitations, heavily influenced by the South. There was, of course, the Dunning School out of Columbia University, which regarded Reconstruction as completely corrupt and was very Southern oriented. And that influence really permeated historical writing, I think, through much of the 20th century, even through the middle of the 20th century, about Lincoln. And there's only recently been, I think, a return to understanding Lincoln as a political figure. And that's what I've tried to do.
Right. So what I'm really interested in is what is it about politics, of the past, present, that really appeals to you, or that you find so fascinating or interesting that you decided to kind of make a career out of it?
That's an interesting question. Um, I think that I'm interested in politics in the way that some novelists are interested in writing novels. It appeals to me in that I can understand the nature of our country and how it came to be. And the more one understands the past, the more you have a sense of how to act in the present and shape the future. It also appeals to me to watch how human beings deal with unique situations and circumstances that are not necessarily of their own making, and which they attempt to shape to their own ends. And you can learn everything about how humans behave, how people behave under the most stressful conditions as they make history in their own time. So it's very compelling to me. Politics is also an art. It's a Alexander Hamilton talked about the small arts of politics, and there's that. But there are also sort of there's a higher art to politics too. People fail attempting it, and occasionally they succeed. And even people who succeed can meet tragic ends. Certainly Lincoln did, and it in which the workings of in the wheels of history turned at his greatest moment of triumph into the greatest tragedy. So these are, and the Lincoln story itself is the central story to understand from my point of view, the making of the modern American nation. And from there to grasp where we are and what's forged the circumstances that we face now. Just because one doesn't understand the history doesn't mean that the history isn't there. and doesn't have a grip on people, and even people who claim to understand it and distort it and lie about it, and claim it as their own when they're falsehoods and myths, are themselves in the grip of that history. So, as somebody who is not only a writer of history and biography, but active in the political life of our time, um, I want to uh, possess the greatest understanding I can.
Yeah, I think over the last couple of years, Americans, maybe hopefully, realized the importance of having a good leader, and Lincoln is widely recognized historically as one of our greatest leaders, not just in the United States but worldwide. In your opinion, what traits, what quality traits make a good leader?
Well, uh, Lincoln was his leadership is defined the presidency in his time. When he became president, people thought it was highly unlikely, and they regarded him as a provincial lawyer, as William Henry Seward, who became a Secretary of State, senator from New York, called him a rival. Lincoln himself referred to himself at one point as a hayseed, as a as a uh, and um, and yet and people who thought of Lincoln in his time didn't give him credit for being um, a major figure, um, especially when early on when he came to the presidency. His qualities were um, that he had an ability. He had great political experience from his earliest age. He had run for office since the age of 22. He was constantly running for office. His first job was a political appointment, working as a clerk in the post office. All postal appointees were political appointees in those days, patronage jobs. I'd run for the state legislature, lost, then ran again and won. He was the floor leader for the Whig Party in the Illinois legislature before he was 30. He understood what political men wanted and needed and how they operated. He was a keen observer of human nature. He watched people and tried to assess their motives. He made himself into a lawyer. People didn't go to law school. They read in the law with people. He did this on the frontier, and he became a very cunning and yet accessible lawyer who could appeal to juries of the most common people in courthouses in central Illinois in the mid 19th century. And that he came from the people. He understood them, and he had spent years assessing them and learning what worked in terms of persuasion. Lincoln was also self-educated. Um, he denigrated his own education because it was not formal. He had only a few weeks in a school when he was a boy, but he read voraciously, um, and including geometry. He would stay up late at night reading Euclid's Elements in order to learn geometry. And the reason was he was studying logic, which he would apply in his legal practice, in his cases, and also politically, in how to make an argument. He was a brilliant orator. Oratory was a major subject, even in universities in the 19th century. It was a formal study. Um, and Lincoln picked it up on his own, and no one was of his time, as we know, was more eloquent. And he did write his own speeches, and he had a sense of how to frame an argument, how to win a jury, which became the American public. Lincoln said, public opinion's everything. He referred to holding large parties in the White House of 1,000 people and calling them his public opinion baths. He would talk to everybody and gather the information. There was no formal polling then, but Lincoln knew the entire histories of the districts in Illinois and then later throughout the country, and how they had voted over the years, and could calculate them based on the information that he would receive from his political allies and informants. He was constantly doing this. Lincoln was also somebody interested in popular culture at all levels. He was a superstitious man. He believed in omens. It's not clear that he took them seriously, but he would say that he did. He did attend some of his wife's seances to talk to the dead. It's not clear how deeply he was into spiritualism, using mediums to communicate with those on the other side. But spiritualism in the 19th century was as large in some ways as any of the other major religions. It was a widespread thing. Lincoln loved the theater. He was a theater goer from a very early age. There's no radio, there's no television, there's no internet. What there is theater. And Lincoln loves Shakespeare, he loves poetry. He's memorized whole swaths of Shakespeare. He loves talking as president to the actors, the great Shakespearean actors. How do you do it? And it's not only through involves his love of Shakespeare. He's an actor on the stage himself. He is assimilating this. He's learning what to do, how to behave, how to have the greatest effect. And sometimes it's so stunning it leaves his audiences uncertain how to react to him when he delivers a performance, as he did at the cemetery at Gettysburg, when he gets up and speaks briefly and sits down. What was that? Of the people, by the people, for the people. It was after Edward Everett's hour and a half at least length oration at Gettysburg. Lincoln spoke for the shortest amount of time, and yet it lives today. So Lincoln also had an ability to be, as one of his contemporaries said, a master of myth. He did it by understanding their motives, how political people behave. As he said about one of his cabinet members, about his ambition, he has the worm in his brain. He'll never get it out. And Lincoln was not somebody who was driven by his viscera, his anger, his emotion. He achieved an enormous self-discipline over himself and his emotions. He had suffered a great deal. He had enormous empathy. He had lost his mother at an early age. He was very close to his sister and lost her. His father was a difficult man and did not want him to read. Lincoln left his family at the age of 21. He called himself a slave to his father because his father rented him out as an indentured servant and took his wages. So Lincoln is somebody who has seen all sorts of life. And Lincoln also experienced all sorts of characters on the frontier. Um, uh, in the kind of characters who populate the novels of Mark Twain. And Lincoln's sensibility in some ways was not so different from Twain's. I'm sure they would have hit it off had Lincoln lived and ever met Twain, which I don't doubt he would have had he lived, because Lincoln was a great admirer of Twain's mentor, Artemus Ward, the great humorist, and even read his ridiculous stories to the cabinet, setting them off, especially the more pious ones. So, Lincoln had spent time in Frontier, Illinois. He met every kind of con man, every kind of faker, every kind of phony, every kind of all sorts of people from all kinds of religious backgrounds. I mean, they were, America's filled with, an untold number of sectarian religions that Lincoln encountered. He met Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism. His first opponent was a hellfire evangelical Bible thumping preacher named Peter Cartwright. And at one point, Lincoln went to one of his speeches during the campaign as Cartwright was railing against Lincoln. Cartwright spotted him in the crowd. Cartwright declared he was going to hell. Lincoln declared, "You may think I'm going to hell, but I'm going to the Congress." So, Lincoln was funny. He knew how to distract people with humor and win them over with humor. One woman came up to him and told him, not in a friendly way, that he was the ugliest man she had ever met. And he said that his face was just ridiculously ugly. And Lincoln said, "Madam," and that he was a hypocrite. And he said, "Madam, if I had another face, do you think I would wear this one?" So, and he was clever, he was quick, and he was deep.
Right. And obviously Lincoln, like you just mentioned, grew up fairly poor, which was unusual for the time to, he rose to the presidency and he was from a poor background, loved to read. But what's interesting to me is that's not always self-evident, especially because, um, people that don't have the resources, he didn't spend much time in school. Where did he find out the value of reading books, and why was it so important to him in order to, you know, move up in life?
So the Lincoln family, led by Thomas Lincoln, had left Kentucky, where Lincoln was born, in a log cabin. And Thomas Lincoln was a carpenter and a dirt farmer whose land was lost to a wealthy landowner. He had to compete for wages with slaves. He fled across the Ohio River to the free state of Indiana. Lincoln would say, free states are for poor white people to flee to, and slave states are places for poor white people not to stay in. So it's an interesting perspective. That's his family's perspective. Lincoln, of course, said he hated slavery and that he was naturally anti-slavery. His parents were anti-slavery. They belonged to a very small emancipationist church in rural Kentucky. Very rare. Um, Lincoln learned to read um, by reading the Bible, and he naturally took to it. And um, he also learned to read through newspapers. The circulation of newspapers um, began to spread in the early 19th century. And when people had a newspaper, they wouldn't throw it out. Many people would read the same issue of the paper. They'd hand it off to each other. And they would hand off papers from major cities. The newspapers were very interesting. And you can read them online. Many of them would contain full accounts, word for word, of what went on in the Congress. It'd be like the congressional record. There was very little local news in the newspapers. It was almost all national news. Local news was word of mouth. People knew each other and they would talk to each other. And Lincoln was it was a voracious newspaper reader and would recount that to other children and repeat speeches he heard, parts of the Bible, and so on. When his father sent him off on jobs to be hired, Lincoln would wander. He described his father as a wandering labor boy when he was a youth, and no doubt he was, but Lincoln himself was that. That was a self-description. And Lincoln would attach himself, he would find men who were lawyers in their towns who had libraries. And he would attend courthouses and listen to cases and listen to them speak. And he would read through their books. And that's where he discovered the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and anti-slavery poems and all sorts of things. And his first fiction and the poems of Robert Burns, which he loved, and Shakespeare. And he did it just basically wandering around in rural Indiana, self-educating himself. And that's how Lincoln learned to read. He and his law partner, William Henry Herndon, in Springfield, Illinois, a two-man law firm, had the largest private library in central Illinois. And Herndon would collect books, many of the books that Lincoln wanted to read. And they also subscribed to all sorts of newspapers and journals, not only in the United States, but the major journals from England. Lincoln also liked to read science. Lincoln was very keen on learning about science. Strangely enough, his birthday is the same as Charles Darwin's. And they're both men of a scientific bent, obviously. And Lincoln founded the National Academy of Science as president. He was deeply interested in how things worked. He is the only president to hold a patent
For what?
for how to lift boats through locks. He as a boatsman, he had been on boats that had gotten stuck, and he developed a patent for it. He had built a little wood model of it. I've seen it. It's in the Smithsonian. It's been shown in the little Lincoln Museum here across from Ford's Theater. Lincoln was a patent lawyer. He was involved in many cases involving inventions and who owned the patents. He liked to take things apart. When the telegraph came in, he was fascinated by it and learned how it worked. He was a master of the telegraph, which was the internet of its time, and speeded everything up and transformed media, the speed, the acceleration of news. Lincoln understood how to use this. He spent a good deal of his presidency in the telegraph room of the War Department. It's where he wrote the Emancipation Proclamation. Um, and he was deeply involved in the development of weaponry during the Civil War, including ironclad ships, and sat on the board developing the Monitor line of ships,
Mhm.
um, overseeing their production. He understood how things worked, and he was a major believer in science.
Uh, they say often that behind every great man is a great woman, and I'm sure it goes in reverse as well. Um, but one of the great pleasures I had once was reading a book by David McCullough. It's a biography of John Adams, which is phenomenal. But the great part about the books was finding out this whole new character that I knew nothing about, and that's Abigail Adams, and
Right.
how influential she was on uh, her husband John. Was Mary Todd the same to Lincoln? Did they have that kind of relationship
Well,
themselves?
there's some people who write about that relationship who regard her as a complete drag on him and regard the marriage as hell itself. And that Lincoln, somehow rose above it and survived it. That's not my view. I have a very different view of the Lincoln marriage. Um, Mary Lincoln, Mary Todd, was from a um, wealthy Kentucky family from Lexington. Her father was the business partner and political ally of the most powerful man in Kentucky, Henry Clay. She knew Clay as a child. She wanted to marry a president, she said, when she was a child. She even told Clay she would marry him. She was considered a volatile little Whig, violent little Whig. She had a volatile personality. Her mother died when she was young. Like Lincoln, they had that in common. Her stepmother was unkind to her. Her father was someone she looked up to, admired, and loved, and was distant and often absent. She was a younger girl among sisters. Her eldest sister married um, Ninian Edwards Jr., who was the son of the territory, who had been the son of a man who had been the territorial governor of Illinois and came to Springfield and lived in the biggest mansion on what was called Aristocracy Hill. Um, Lincoln and Mary had a fraught relationship to begin with, up and down courtship with which they had broken up. Lincoln didn't know how to deal with women. Uh, he had he was not good at this, and uh, when he married, and her family regarded Lincoln as they called him a plebe. They did not approve of the marriage. They regarded him as low class. She thought he could make something of himself with her. Lincoln, when he married her, had no family. She was his family. He gained a family through her. He was nobody. And he had left his family behind, and he was an isolate. And suddenly he had this wife. Within a year, they had a child, less than a year, Robert Todd Lincoln. Um, and and they would have other boys. Um, and She was completely devoted to his political career. She was as ambitious, if not more so, than he was for him. There were times when he would underestimate himself because of his social sense of social inferiority, or the comfort he had with not pushing himself to another level, and she would have none of it. She was a constant goad. She believed he was always the best man, always. When they first got married, and there were only two of them, she regarded them as our Lincoln party. So she was a very unusual woman. she's a political wife. In the she did not get along with a lot of the people around Lincoln, but she was indispensable to him. Lincoln, for all of the difficulties in his marriage, was an uxorious husband. He adored her, regardless of everything, and said at one point at a White House party, um, looking at his wife across the room to a friend, imagine that after, all these years, I managed to have her as my wife.
Hmm.
So, Lincoln, who we think of as, the great unapproachable man, was still inside of himself, a poor boy at some level. And Mary Lincoln had helped shape him up. And I believe there was no Lincoln without Mary.
Right. That's a interesting perspective. What I find very interesting is when people today compare presidents to current politicians or current presidents. I often hear, for example, Joe Biden is trying to do something that, like pass the New Deal, like the FDR would, or um, uh, Barack Obama is like that person, or George Bush is like that guy. And do you think that's a is there any utility to comparing presidents, or is it just something people do because that's what they do in sports, so they'll do it in politics as well?
It's interesting, people rank presidents. You know, um, Strangely enough, Trump was not ranked as the worst. I would certainly, even with James Buchanan listed as last, I would certainly never put Buchanan below Trump. Um, but um, there will always be comparisons of presidents. What's more interesting is the influence of other politicians and presidents on those who became president, as opposed to the comparisons that we might make to them and our attempts to categorize them or, say so and so was like so and so. But um, in the case of Lincoln, his great model was Henry Clay, who never became president, the man who never became president. Ran for president and lost. Senator from Kentucky, great figure. Also a poor boy who rose to great heights, and a politician. And Lincoln himself, um, in when he was in Congress and in the late 1840s, didn't support Henry Clay for the nomination, even though he was, as he put it, his beau ideal, because he thought there were others who could win. Lincoln was interested in winning. He was interested in exercising power for certain ends. And yet, he learned a lot from other political figures, especially uh, um, that model of Henry Clay, man who didn't become president. Can't think of another president that Lincoln would model himself on. It was not Jackson, and it was not Washington, who he revered, but he was so little like Washington personally and Washington was so godlike in Lincoln's mind that it would have been an amazing conceit to compare yourself to someone at the height of Olympus like Washington. So Lincoln would talk about other presidents and what they contributed and where they stood in and what they had done in their relationship to contemporary politics that he was involved in, like Jefferson. So he would say, and he did say, Jefferson was a slave owner, but he wrote the Declaration of Independence and said all men are created equal. So all honor to Jefferson. And he understood the anti-slavery side of Jefferson and interpreted that, and the side that that in all men are created equal didn't distinguish and said that human rights were equal for all, regardless of who they were, and universal.
Yeah, that that kind of brings me to my next question. I mentioned earlier that your earlier book, The Clinton Wars, you spent some time as a senior advisor to President Bill Clinton. Did you ever have conversations in the White House about the weight of history, or maybe the person he looked up to historically and who he kind of tried to emulate, or was that not did you guys not have time for those kinds of conversations?
We had some conversations. He particularly looked up to Lincoln,
Mm.
um, and he to this day reads everything about Lincoln that appears. I never had a conversation with President Clinton about Jefferson, even though his middle name is Jefferson, William Jefferson Clinton. It's interesting. Um, he's interested. He was interested in minor presidents and the difficulties that they faced and how they dealt with it.
Like who? I'm curious.
He read a book about Hayes, uh, like that. He was interested in all of them, but particularly that sort of thing. Um, it was how they handled it and how they dealt with the great issues of their day. Um, he um, he was very interested in Roosevelt. Um, President Clinton was another poor boy, as we know. His father died before he was born. His mother was very poor in rural Arkansas. She went off to train as a nurse in New Orleans to nursing school and left him with her parents, his grandparents, who ran a general store mostly run on barter in rural Arkansas. And his grandfather um, regarded Roosevelt as God. They were FDR Democrats. And as Clinton has said, when you died, you went to Roosevelt. So he had a sense, a very, lived a sense of how people regarded a president who were, ordinary people, common people. And he also had a sense of what it meant in their lives to make change. And I think that the Roosevelt example was the one that existed for him. Of course, he met President Kennedy, famously at that event where he shook his hand. I think it's called Boys Town,
Hmm.
and it may be the name of it. And But he told me he also, he was really interested in Robert Kennedy. We had a long talk about that because of the way that Bobby Kennedy, in his brief campaign for the presidency in 1968, before he was murdered, spoke to working class whites and blacks and tried to bring them together. And that was what Clinton was interested in.
Uh, Obviously, you spent a lot of days, in close proximity to the president. You had a lot of conversations. What was the if you had to pick one thing, what was the main thing that you learned from spending time with a president about the job, about how it changes people, if it changes people, and just your perception of the presidency to this day?
Well, there's so much to talk about
Oh,
that, especially down to the presidency of this day, because the presidents are very different. Um, um, Clinton uh, Washington is filled with people who are the smartest people in the room. And it's filled with people who are, the A students at the best schools, and they study the hardest, and they focus on their careers, and they get here and they rise, and they're very smart. But Bill Clinton, I found, was the smartest person in the room, and almost any room. And he was president. He was in the room. People deferred to him, but he never acted like the smartest person in the room. And yet he had great, detailed knowledge of everything from foreign policy to economics to social policy, and read widely and deeply. I don't know anyone who read more. Or Clinton said, if you want to go into politics, the first thing you should do is talk to a lot of people who aren't like you. He was upset if he could be in a room and he couldn't talk to every person. When he talked to people, he didn't do the Washington thing of looking over his shoulder to see if there was someone better he could go talk to. He was always talking to you, and he always wanted to learn something. So, highly unusual person.
That's
And
I feel like, I'm sorry, but I feel like that's noticeable to this day. When Joe Biden had his inauguration, there was, the cameras were pointing at, the former presidents attending, Obama, and everyone wanted to talk to Bill Clinton, and he almost couldn't leave the dais without shaking everyone's hand. It's a wonderful skill, I would imagine, to be able to do that.
it's more than a skill, it's who he is. But he's also, he's honed it to a fine art as well. But it's also who he is, and he's genuinely interested in people. And he's interested in, all sorts of things, music. He reads lots of mystery novels. He reads the latest, works of social policy. I was out the other night for dinner with my friend and former colleague at the Washington Post, where I worked, Tom Edsall, who writes column for the New York Times. Mm-hmm. And Tom brought up his first time meeting Bill Clinton. And he was at an event, and Bill Clinton came up to him and said, "Aren't you Tom Edsall?" And he said, "I am." He said, "How do you know that?" He said, "Well, you look like your picture on the back of your book." Read his book. Tom had written a book on race and politics called Chain Reaction, and Clinton had read it. Wow. So that's very much like Clinton. He had a deep psychological understanding of people in politics and people generally. Yeah. And and he could also often use that not only to feel their pain, famously, but to devastating effect by winning them over. And he did that to Newt Gingrich, who wanted to destroy him, and Clinton penetrated his insecurities and what he needed, and that he wanted to be an intimate, and to be told he had valuable opinions on national security, things like this. And he would wind up doing reasonable things when he was in their conversation, and he would go back to the Republican House conference, and explain to them what he'd agreed to, and they would throw chairs at him, and decide that he couldn't go meet with Clinton alone because he gave in too much. So
Yeah.
um, uh, it's more than a skill, and politics depends on that sort of thing.
Yeah. To begin wrapping up in the interest of time, obviously, I ask all my guests at the end of every podcast two questions. I'm going to bundle them together and you answer in whatever order you please. The first one is, what, if anything, gives you hope for the future? And the second one is, what are five books, that fiction, nonfiction, that you would recommend to people?
Um, well, what gives me hope for the future? I'm naturally an optimistic person, and I don't suffer writer's block, for example, like a lot of people I know. Um, I, I, I think I'm not naive. And what gives me hope for the future is the ability of people to face the problems that are before us and come together and meet them. Although, these are formidable, problems that I hope are not insuperable. And what also gives me hope is the fact that I now have a grandchild, a granddaughter named Tanlunga, and
Congratulations.
thank you, who's 6 months old. And um, I certainly want a better world for her and believe she will take part in making a better world for her generation that I can't even imagine. Um, five books. That's a good one.
Mm.
Um, um, I read a lot of books all the time, every day, and I just cut through lots of material, books and papers and articles as I'm writing on Lincoln, and they're all of a certain period. So I spend most of my time reading that. There's very few things I like more than discovering um, a memoir of somebody, usually an obscure figure from the 19th century I haven't read before. I recently, um, some months ago, actually reread the parts of James Parton's multi-volume biography of Andrew Jackson, the parts about nullification and Jackson's confrontation over Calhoun, and that's great. No one reads it, but it's really great. Parton was a journalist who became a historian and biographer. Um, uh, I'm reading Frederick Longvall's JFK
Okay.
first volume. It's a really good book, and uh, it presents a very fresh view of John F. Kennedy, who I'm always interested in. Um, and he comes alive as um, um, somebody with a very developing intelligence, um, and unusual sensibility, ability to be disinterested about the world and come to his own conclusions, and yet is you know comes out of a a storied and somewhat difficult family, as we know. So I've been reading that. Um, I don't know. I've read so much. It's hard to remember. When I was a boy, I read uh, the whole Landmark books series on American history. There were young adult, even before, biographies and books about American history. Um, I studied American Studies at Brandeis University, and my professor was Sack von Berkovich, interesting name, but one of the great scholars of Puritanism. And I read all the early works of Puritanism, sermons of Jonathan Edwards, and the works of Nathaniel Hawthorne and Moby Dick and Twain and Faulkner and Hemingway and Fitzgerald and the whole canon. Interestingly, Pete Buttigieg's great influence was Sack von Berkovich later in his life. It's interesting. So that all, reading all of those American works had a great influence on me. When I met my wife many decades ago, I was reading John Dos Passos's USA trilogy. I haven't looked at it recently, but I recommended it to her, bought her a copy then. I don't know if it worked as a artifact of courtship. But it's a really interesting book of its time about the period of the Progressive Era, World War I, and the 1920s and the Depression. It's a really interesting experimental novel of its time. As a boy in my teens, I was influenced, and strangely enough, by the novels of Upton Sinclair, who was a socialist, and he wrote a series of novels about a character he called Lanny Budd. And Lanny Budd was an art dealer who would travel around Europe as the secret agent of Franklin Roosevelt and meet all of the world leaders and get the interesting situations in the 20s and 30s and during World War II. And so these are novels from that point of view about the politics and of that world, which I learned as a teenager, partly through that.
It's a good list.
Yeah.
I think you shared quite a bit.
Yeah, I can keep going.
I'm sure. I do want to
thinking of the more obscure things that people wouldn't ordinarily read.
Right. I do want to say before we sign off that it's a great privilege and thank you for coming onto the podcast and speaking with me. I enjoyed it. It was a great conversation. I look forward to doing it again in the future.
Well, thanks so much, Stanley. I enjoyed it too, and look forward to speaking to you again.
Yep. Same here. All the best to you.
Thank you.